Well, hello everyone. Today we're going to do a debate about the neoliberalism critique. On the affirmative, we will have Shri defending whatever. The Right to Education Act from the DDIX packet. On the negative, we're going to have Sean go for the neoliberalism critique. Yeah, should be exciting. I guess, yeah, we're going to return for a little bit. Does everyone know what the neoliberalism case says? Who wants to toss a hand up if they know what neoliberalism is? Apparently, basically no. Yeah, what is neoliberalism?
It's a social imaginary that says there's
He knows.
that it's a belief that there's a set of conditions in the world, including that it's too complex for any one person to understand, that the government needs to regulate some market externalities or keep the market being efficient. And there's a couple of different rules that I'm missing.
It's an argument about neoliberalism is a disagreement about market efficiency and generating productive markets. So the affirmative is likely to say that we should maintain some form of neoliberalism, while the negative is going to say those ideas and markets are often very problematic. Yeah.
So is it easier to return for me to sit in the front row? Do you want here or I can sit in the front row. Okay.
Contention 1 is education. Current educational policies based on a patchwork of different state policies causes inefficiency. Federal guarantee of education necessary for resolution. Lose 6. SCLB has done nothing in common sense education expectation. Each state has discretion to revise standards and set those standards subject to this results of a patchwork that varies. The federal role in education as guided the government serve as the director of opportunity, and that undermines educational standards. DEX competitiveness. AP 10. The U.S. students grow behind higher performing nation scores or far behind the high score countries. This is a wake-up call. International assessments irrelevant as graduates enter a global job market and a competitive knowledge-based economy. Children are at a disadvantage. That puts long-term economic prosperity at risk. If the U.S. boosted PISA scores by 25 points, there would be a gain of $41 trillion. And competitiveness is key to U.S. leadership and international cooperation. Solves multiple existential threats in document 10. U.S. students are falling behind the global race of competitiveness to become more competitive and collaborative. It's a win-win game. International competition is growing because the world is flat and companies can digitize, automate, and outsource. The nation that out-educates us is going to out-compete us. Competition that increases collaboration, poverty, disease, sustainable energy, nuclear peril, terrorism, global warming. The U.S. cannot meet any of these challenges without collaborating. This will require students to develop better skills. And competitiveness is real. Neoclassical economists are wrong. This is all 11. Krugman argues that competitiveness is a myth. Krugman is wrong. Refusal of neoclassical economists to recognize competitiveness is an issue. Krugman Freedom is like the boy who finds himself floating a racing, yells, I'm not racing, better to pretend that you're not racing, until you wake up having lost 10 million manufacturing jobs, 10% unemployment, and a horrific trade balance when you refuse to believe that you're in a race you're going to lose. Countries seek to win in the highest value. Crude underestimates the impact of country strategies, shift comparative advantage in tech sectors, and only leadership gains the benefits. Markets will not self-adjust for declining economies combining too. The don't worry position claiming that markets have self-adjusting mechanisms and that comparative advantage will assure each country or world changes radically if one considers the importance of knowledge factors. These develop through the learning process and benefiting capital progress ceases to be public good. It circulates inside the restricted networks. It requires high-quality material assets. Firms benefit less from the imitation of free tech spillovers. They require investments of innovation and cooperation. And even if countries aren't corporations, competitive theory is useful for mapping out economic growth. Martin insists. Regions can be seen as assets and as unreasonable. Think of the terms competitors, but even if improvement is right, advocate caution against analogies between the firm and the nation. Regional bodies are becoming active economic governance and are devising policies to improve productivity because of the increasing trend of policymakers to think of regions as sites of competitive advantage. It is important to embrace competitiveness. Impact is great power, war, and economic collapse. U.S. leadership is key. Haas 13. The biggest challenges facing the U.S. are second-rate primary and secondary schools and slow growth. Failure to deal with international challenges will come at a price. The world's success of the success of the U.S. If the U.S. growth accelerates, capacity to consume other countries will increase boosting growth. The only day the U.S. has the potential to drive global recovery. The U.S. remains a unique source of innovation and ideas. The world faces challenges from weapons mass destruction, climate change, trade, cyberspace, global health, armed conflicts. While the order requires leadership to formulate some responses, there is only one candidate, the U.S. alone. No other country has the combination, capability, and outlook. The alternative is a world that does not let at all chronic crisis and conflict. The economic collapse causes more time than 15. Asymmetrical dependencies and negative trade expectations generate tensions leading to conflict. If leaders anticipate decline, they may blame external dependence, contemplate force, adopt protectionist policies, and refuse to be deterred by nuclear arms or socioeconomic calamity. Such a shift could happen abruptly. Deterrence could lose credibility. Great powers might gamble. The other yields in cyber or conventional war. And the plan is key. One, regulations. A national plan is necessary to establish consistent inter- and intrastate educational standards for equality. Lose 6. Treating people as a unit and integrating the compensatory aid. The program is specify a minimum level of effort that states must meet as a framework of cooperation which the government would guarantee to every state that any program of national aid would involve sums of money that the states would find difficult to forego. Federal assistance percentage could be created. The program will not serve interstate, also interstate equality makes it states to allow states to channel aid towards advantaged students. Each state should be required to bring up all districts, but narrow disparities. This would drive up the neediest school districts within state allocations. 2, funding. States can't support independently. Federal intervention is key to equal distribution. Lose 6. Patchwork of state funding reflect disparate levels of effort to not effectively support national education goals. First, narrowing differences is a role. Only the federal government can fulfill it as a key reform that would orient school children as equal. Second, narrowing interstate disparities will require distribution of federal aid later commitment by each state. Third, federal aid should take into account geographic differences. Education power variance between state standards-based reform demands more resources than what is being committed. Federal rules should promote interstate equality, motivate states to adjust federal aid for geographic differences, providing financial aid that is sufficient to enable the poorest states. 3, constitutional guarantee, legal protection solves solvency deficits and periods. Louis 13, the United States education system says 17 out of 40 countries ahead of the U.S. has a commitment in common constitutional guaranteed education, centralizing education in these countries, established baseline requirements. The constitutional amendment is vital to results. Every country that best has a constitutional guarantee constructed as rights of citizens. Education is falling through the cracks of where there is a constitutional guarantee. Litigation produce results. Law can begin to alter nationwide. Without it, the U.S. will stay average. And plan the United States federal government should clarify that the 14th Amendment encompasses a legislative duty to ensure that all children have the adequate educational opportunity for equal citizenship. Consents to solvency. The plan solves and reinterprets the 14th Amendment to establish substantive rights, secures and social citizenship tradition. Lose 6. The 14th Amendment authorizes obligates Congress to ensure a form of educational opportunity, guarantees natural citizenship, and obligates the government to secure full membership, effective participation, dignity, and citizenship guarantee. Does never realize the potential contemporary interpreters recognize citizenship as a form of substantive guarantees by recovering this law aids to initiate the social citizenship tradition. This is the duty of government to ensure civil, political, social, economic prerequisites for equality. And federal interpretation of education as citizens guarantee and integrates it into constitutional law. Lube 8. An enactment with innovation and durability that reflects various contestation judgment can shape constitutional understanding. This presents schemes establishing normative principles, whether that will stay competitive, whether they're reaffirmed over objection to frame its purposes, enforcing national citizenship. These policies emerge. The policies that emerge are what provide a foundation to integrate understandings into law. The planned fiats pass partisan bargaining. Reforms will be implemented based on empirics, not ideology. Lose 6. A legislative commitment would give priority over the politics wrangling and special interest. If the educational adequacy has constitutional stature, it must reflect more than political bargaining cases. Health and state legislatures are obligated to develop policies based on empirically supported judgments of adequate education. The 14th Amendment demands no less than Congress.
Okay, so the first thing I want to ask you about is this Duncan 10 evidence that says competitiveness is key to U.S. leadership.
Yes.
This evidence was written during the Obama presidency, and presumably the argument that your evidence is making is that the U.S. achievement gap means that the U.S. cannot create global cooperation. Yet, while this evidence was being written, President Obama was successfully negotiating the TTP and successfully negotiating U.S. accession to the Paris Agreement. So what empirical evidence is there that this claim is true?
The plan and the scenario is based off of a long-term strategy. If we don't have intelligent students to put into place, for example, those policies right in the future, then there would be trouble.
Okay, well, what evidence is there that there'll be trouble?
The Duncan evidence indicates that if students, right, are no longer intelligent enough to carry on sort of the mandates of globalization, then there won't be the possibility for independence.
Okay, so I want to ask you about the language you just used. What are the mandates of globalization?
Well, for example, interdependence, right, establishing, for example, trade between countries.
Okay, interdependence, yeah, I got you. Sounds great. What else?
Trade between countries.
Trade and interdependence are the
That's right.
mandates of globalization. Okay, wonderful. This Tonneson evidence says that countries, start getting pretty angry with each other when there are negative trade expectations.
Yep.
President Trump, makes me gag saying that, has repeatedly threatened to levy tariffs against a host of different countries and against businesses in the United States. How has that not caused escalation? That's certainly negative trade expectation.
Well, it's certainly causing tensions, right? And the whole point is that the plan reverses that perception.
Okay, how does the plan reverse the perception of the president threatening to levy tariffs? If anything, maybe 20 years from now, it would have some effect. But right now, I don't see how that would have any effect.
Well, the national education standard would create sort of an understanding that we should, for example, learn things like cross-cultural skills, linguistic skills that we should use to, for example, establish interdependence between other countries.
Why do you think that other countries like China care more about a couple thousand more American students being able to speak Mandarin than the U.S. having like a 30% tariff on steel imports?
Well, for example, right, if students are no longer able to communicate with China, that literally creates an impossibility of trade in the future, and that would affect their economy. They would
Okay, so the advantage is that if we don't do the act, no one will be able to speak Chinese in the U.S.
No.
Okay, well, all right. So you said that the impact to loss of competitiveness is great power or economic collapse. And a couple of these scenarios talk about why leadership is key. Doesn't North Korea disprove the claim that U.S. leadership and military power are successful in deterring proliferation or rising powers?
Why?
Well, they're testing ICBMs. We've repeatedly negotiated with them to try to enforce sanctions. It's failed, and for 20 years...
Their tests are trash. We've sanctioned them so much that they don't have any resources.
I agree with you that 5-6 years ago, maybe they were trash. Okay.
Still trash.
All right. Did you send this out to like the camp or anything?
Oh, I did not. Should I?
Yeah, we'll post it at the end.
Okay.
That would be fun.
Cool.
We wouldn't want to. A couple, this is not the heart of the debate, but we'll do a couple comments about what's happened so far. First, I want to emphasize, I feel like the delivery of that 1AC is something that everybody should be paying attention to in a couple ways. First, it started at a comprehensible speed, right? Everybody flowed the beginning of the 1AC. I was like, wait, what's happening? I've been obsessed with this in lab, and now everybody else in the campus hear my thoughts about it. Two, the 1AC is constructed in such a way that there's anticipation that there will be a larger theoretical defense of competitiveness, right? Not simply competitiveness is important for preventing this terminal impact, but also here are the tenets of economic theory that we believe demonstrate that competitiveness is important, okay? I suspect that that will be relevant for what we've planned to have this debate about, but would also be relevant in a lot of circumstances where, if the affirmative is reading a competitiveness advantage in this day and age, it doesn't anticipate that that might trigger a 1NC critique for which they would need some theoretical defenses of the economic reasoning that they've engaged in. I think that the 1AC is a little bit behind the curve, and so they built in some of the theoretical evidence that might be important for answering that set of questions. Notice also what did not happen. The 1AC didn't just take out all the impacts or attempt to remove the things that could be criticized. They instead chose to make a choice about what they will defend, right? And they added to the components that they know that they're going to need to defend, rather than try to just subtract out of all the things that could possibly be criticized. Oftentimes, when I see affirmatives make mistakes about affirmative critique strategy, it's because they're approaching it from a subtractive point of view. Just like, well, we'll take out all of the things that are links, or we'll take out all of the things that could be critiqued. Can't be done. Okay? Instead, think about that as, what do we want to choose to defend? Okay? What do we want to choose to defend? And I think that that's something that happened here. Last thing for me, one other little delivery thing about the 1AC. Did you notice there was a pause at the end of each card for breath before reading the next tag? It flowed along so nicely, like the transition to each new argument was really clear. That's something that a lot of people that I see who are trying to increase their speed, which is most of you all, struggle with. Okay? You believe that it's just like, the way to get faster is just to compact down so that I never have any rhythm, I never have any pauses, I'm just speaking all the time. No, do not do that. Okay? Do this instead. Cross-X. Using some outside knowledge to build in premises to questions, right? None of those questions is, explain to me what competitiveness is, right? Or explain to me how U.S. leadership prevents war, right? Trying to somehow, I guess, trip up someone with a question that just allows the app to explain, right? Instead, building in a premise. Okay, that first question about, at the same time that this evidence was being written, President Obama was negotiating the TPP, signing the Paris Accord. Doesn't this disprove the importance of U.S. competitiveness standards for larger leadership and multilateral negotiation? Right? That's a much more powerful question because it requires that you either reject the premise or answer in light of that premise. Right? It's kind of setting up the question in such a way that the affirmative actually has something they must respond to that is a claim rather than the affirmative must simply explain what's going on. Lastly, defining terms. When Sean asked the follow-up question about the, requirements of mandates of globalization. So he picks up on a phrase that the app uses, like, I'm curious about this mandates of globalization thing. I suspect we'll hear about this later. Okay. But that question is being asked just in a way to get the affirmative to define what they mean. What do you mean by that? That's the place where, why is that an explanatory question instead of one that builds in a premise? Why, given that we just said, like, let's ask, kind of argumentative questions that ask claims, anyone want to take a guess at why that was the place where Sean asked the open-ended question, the one that just says, tell me what that is. Why did that happen there? And why are we still saying that it's good rather than bad? This is some high-level Cross-X thinking. Let's see if someone can take a stab at it. Yeah.
Just trying to garner links for the new.
Okay. I agree with you that it's generally a sort of link-oriented question. That's some good thinking. Why is it reasonable then to ask this one as the open-ended question?
It can actually say things that you normally wouldn't necessarily say if he was down to the cards for Sean to be able to use.
Yeah. So for one, it's like, talk more about this. Like, a bunch of the evidence doesn't really talk about this in these terms. Do we think that some of Sean's evidence likely talks about some of these concepts using similar terms? Like, if you're familiar with some of the neoliberalism evidence, does it say that perhaps globalization has been treated too much as an inevitable force that dictates the way in which we make political choices rather than having us make those choices to change what globalization or political economy might mean? I think so. And so that's the place where Sean believes there's nothing that Sri can say that I'm worried about. The more that he says here, the more I will be able to use, right? Which is not the case if he just asks, why is competitiveness important? Because that's not all stuff that Sean can use. That's all stuff that Sri can use, right? Because he's going to need to explain the importance of competitiveness later in the debate.
I just had two things I wanted to add. Why do we think Sri didn't read the second advantage that was read in the other thing?
So we could get ahead on defending competitiveness?
Yeah, instead of saying, I'm going to say a bunch of different things in the 1AC and I'll just throw out a bunch of scenarios and figure out what sticks later, Shree's decided I'm going to defend one thing and defend it in depth in order to have some better answers to criticisms later. And just be ahead on one set of assumptions it is true. The second thing I wanted to get to was, why do you think Sean is asking all these questions about trade terms? From anyone who paid attention to Sean's competitiveness lecture, what is the interrelationship between competitiveness and trade terms? Yes.
Trade terms are used as a means to increase competitiveness and stimulates like local economic growth.
So all these questions he's asking about, aren't tariffs more important for your Thomason evidence? Aren't they more important for all these things? Why? He's getting that out early in order to already start some impact comparison from the 1AC cross-X for some impacts he's likely to get to.
Okay, so we're just going to be one off.
Nope. Make your own work. Okay. Anybody not ready? Okay.
The affirmative locks in a global war for talent, configuring U.S. education towards skill development, competition, and STEM, ensures global inequality and economic nationalism. Brown to knock the global war for talent, grows national prosperity, class, maximize competitiveness, to be competitive globally. Nations need high-tech jobs, as other nations are competing. Nations need to adjust education policy. The global war for talent reinforces the hegemonic development model of the competition state. The war for talent threatens educational justice and equality of opportunity. The conclusion is nations have to either tolerate much higher levels of income inequality, the potential flight of talented workers is the new competitive threat that involves giving the creatives what they want in primary and secondary education. Commitments to comprehensive schooling have been abandoned. This process promotes hyper-meritocracy. The global war for talent undermines the rationale for public education and promotes educational privatization. The war for talent threatens accumulation by dispossession. Rich nations procure skilled labor developed and paid for by poorer countries. Economic inequalities both within and between nations are vastly increasing. The war for talent pays little attention to the social structure of competition. The impact is extinction and global structural violence. Neoliberalism generates resource and social crisis while creating a planetary health crisis that destroys everyday quality of life. Spark in 16, neoliberalism and austerity have been tied to vast embodied suffering, global crises, and health, and the consequences of neoliberal politics, ideologies, and global consequences of cutback in healthcare by neoliberal austerity are a world delivered a fuel crisis, a food crisis, and a financial crisis. The impact of climate change has been seriously underestimated. These events of global causes, they are the result of massive failures in international systems. The government nations, the assumption market forces can solve most problems has not proved true. Inequality, financial volatility, and the race to the bottom tendencies associated with relentless global competition are neoliberal health conditioning, as are climate change, pollution, and food and water insecurity, freeing up market capitalism, freedom of additional carbon, creating the greenhouse gas effect. We have not done things to lower emissions because those things conflict with deregulated capitalism, leading to dead ends in climate negotiations. The bodies of the poor are left vulnerable to floods, storms, desertification, droughts, heat waves, and disease outbreaks, ocean acidification, aquifer depletion, overfishing, biodiversity loss, and chemical exposure, all threaten ecological systems. The deaths and injuries of workers through hyper-exploitation, suicide, factory fires, building collapses, and industrial disasters are egregious embodiments of vulnerability. The judge should vote negative to embrace the commons as an educational praxis. Embracing the commons as praxis means refusing the neoliberal model of education as workforce training. The alternative asserts the importance of collectivity, developing educational institutions that cultivate social ecology and interdependence. Slater and 14, educational struggles against enclosure claim the necessity of imagining alternative ways of organizing, actualizing such features dependent upon ecological ways of being. An appropriate response might be curriculum that make the implication of ethics, ecology, and politics clear in educational struggles. A key mechanism in capturing the common and producing neoliberal subjects has been logics of human capital and competitive individualism into educational reforms. These enclosures reduce spaces of cooperation and collectivity. Neoliberal policies fracture social bonds under crisis-fueled competition. The common is the powerful source of social energy for producing new educational collectivity. Educational struggles problematize linkages between educational labor and work, destabilizing the notion of productivity and hegemonic work ethic, provide the foundation for new visions of socio-ecological life. Moving beyond productivism entails challenging the economization of students, which sorts educational life to maximize capitalist efficiency. Educating against productivism might focus on dismantling the contrived public-private bifurcation of social life. The struggle to constitute common subjects is ultimately an educational problem in which the analytical frame shifts from the question of the individual nature to the possibilities of collective constitution. Creating new narratives outside neoliberalism is a prerequisite for resolving global existential crises. Large system change is impossible absent alternative narratives. The repetition of neoliberal memes only tightens the grip of right-wing populism. It means they see the political whack. In 16, neoliberalism is crumbling. Neoliberalism's excess has fueled populist movements. The U.S. election of Trump and the rise of populism points to a desire for change. It's time to devise a new narrative. Shareholder wealth maximization dominates economic thinking. The result of Mont Pelerin is a familiar set of memes. The memes I'm talking about refer to ideas, phrases, symbols, and images that replicate from person to person. Recognizable memes form the basis of today's dominant economic narrative. Free markets, competition, individual but not shared responsibility.
responsibility and maximization of company and shareholder wealth, their power to convey the underlying story illustrates why that change seems necessary. It's so difficult. Changes don't fit neatly into market logic because they include both social and ecological values. Such problems are difficult to resolve because there are just too many groups with different ideas. Recent work on how to bring about large system change suggests there is really no way to plan or control such change. What is needed is a new set of memes framing a new economic and societal narrative. Tomorrow's narrative needs to recognize the economies are part of societies and nature. A new narrative could provide a more reasonable and effective basis of resolving the key crises of our time, such as warming the planet and the growing gap between rich and poor. Companies can focus on producing collective value rather than shareholder wealth. Hegemony is the crux of global capitalism. Threats of global rivals and great power competition are manufactured to ideologically cement the military-industrial complex. Their expansion of U.S. power ensures structural violence and imperial overstretch foster. All of McChesney and a vast military spending is rooted in the needs of U.S. imperial grand strategy. Washington is not just spending money, it's also building a lasting physical presence around the world. The Iraq War was preceded by massive anti-war movement demonstrating the willingness of the population to seek another way. Washington was able to enlist the media monopoly and marshalling public opinion. What made this possible is a well-oiled, privatized propaganda system. The imperial triangle is confronted with its own contradictions, expansions, and weapons of total destruction, generated growing rebellion against the permanent war economy. The enormous weight of Washington's war machine is not prevented from being stretched to its limits. The U.S. is a society ripe for change. Neoliberal hegemony uses exceptionalism to render its violent side effects invisible, ensuring environmental destruction and global conflict. Be suspicious of all of their answers because their means of structuring the social field erases vast sectors of the global population from view. Nixon and 11 superpower parochialism is a combination of American insularity and America's power to rupture lives and ecosystems over socio-environmental landscapes. Internationally, empires affect great swaths of the planet without the empire's populace being aware. Superpower parochialism has been shaped by the myth of American exceptionalism. The U.S. has wielded unequal power to bend the global regulatory climate in its favor while we make the world safe for multinational corporations. It is by no means clear that they in turn to return the favor. The unreturned favor weighs especially heavily on the global south. Disproportionate influence, U.S. disproportionate influence has been exercised through muscular conservation NGOs. They have a long history of disregarding local human relations to the environment. The beneficiaries are not just American, but transnational corporations, NGOs, and governments from across the North's rich nations working hand in fist with authoritarian regimes. The ass insistence on tech leadership creates a divide between blue-collar labor and immaterial IT work, reproducing economic inequality and crushing quality of life. The ass discourse is a Trojan horse for expanding neoliberalism. Roulette and 14 to insist the economy's knowledge is to paper overpressing realities. Most work is still in agricultural and heavy industry, and the conditions for creative labor is the outsourcing of non-creative tasks to a growing underclass workforce. Statistics point to a real divide in terms of what people do with their lives, with the choices of some driving the choices available to others. Defenses of free trade are epistemologically flawed. Their statistical evidence relies on indefensible modeling assumptions. Global capital mobility, persistent unemployment, and lack of a carbon price all prove free trade produces a net decrease in standards of living. Hart-Landsberg at 6. This card's really long. There's not another one, so if you're wondering why it's taking so long, that's why. Free trade focus hides a much broader agenda explicitly designed to block public regulation in contexts that have little to do with trade. Trips limits the ability of states to deny patents. Gaps would force states to open their national service markets. These agreements are rarely discussed because they raise issues of private versus public power. Arguments promoting free trade rest on comparative advantage. The theory is based on a number of assumptions. There is full employment, labor, and capital are perfectly mobile within a country and do not move across borders. Gains from trade are captured and spent locally. Market prices accurately reflect social costs of products. If they are not satisfied, there is no basis for the theory. The assumption of full employment is obviously false. Equally problematic is implied restructuring, which assumes workers who lose their jobs find employment in the export sector. Even if we ignore this problem, if reallocation is not fast, the economy will suffer unemployment, a reduction in aggregate demand, and recession. The assumption prices reflect social costs is problematic. Markets are dominated by monopolies, and production activities generate significant and negative externalities. Also worthy of challenge is the assumption capital is not mobile. If capital is highly mobile, free trade policies can produce capital flight. Proponents often cite sophisticated simulation studies. These studies are seriously flawed because they rely on the same assumptions. Studies are based on general equilibrium. Authors created a model in which liberalization cannot, by assumption, cause or worsen unemployment. This modeling depends on unrealistic assumptions. One is that tariff reductions will have no effect on deficits. Another assumption is that tariff reductions will have no effect on trade balances. The final one is the existence of full employment. This bias is sufficient to dismiss the study's usefulness as a guide to policy. Working people have been reluctant to challenge it because they have been intimidated by these scholarly arguments. These arguments are based on theories that deliberately misrepresent the workings of capitalism. They can and should be rejected. Okay.
So the alternative is embracing the commons as an educational praxis. Can this include the plan's constitutional guarantees adequate education?
It could include the plan. It cannot include competitiveness discourse.
Okay, cool. Can you name an example of a common that could challenge, for example, multi-billionaire social power?
Yeah, there's a bunch of different proposals in the works that people have suggested. So one of the examples is to use the courts and the law to name the atmosphere as a common or a publicly held trust.
And what grounds would the courts rule in that way on?
There's a bunch of different grounds they could rule on. Some people have argued they could rule on equal protection. There's 2 or 3 other things that have been proposed.
So wait. So the equal protection clause is sufficient to establish things like the commons?
Yeah, well, it was one of the things, yeah, that's why I said
Okay.
that the alternative is not exclusive of the plan, it's just exclusive of the justifications, because all of our evidence, the link and impact evidence, is about competitiveness specifically being a bad narrative to use.
Gotcha. Okay. Your Slater evidence talks about ecological ways of being. What sorts of technology or strategies will these ecological beings adopt to reverse climate change?
Well, it could be anything, I mean, they could, the alt's not like technology's bad, so, renewables
could
are
it-
fine.
Okay. Who determines in the commons what sorts of technologies are used?
Well, I mean, usually, the Slater person is writing about David Bollier, who's writing about a woman named Eleanor Ostrom, who did an anthropological study of commons. And essentially the way they've worked throughout history is that people come together and they do a version of what's called cost effectiveness analysis. So they debate about what they want to see as the democratically agreed to ends of policy.
So they have a town hall and a farmer's market, and then who decides?
Well, I think it's a lot more complicated than that. And historically, these systems prior to Western colonialism were pervasive across the planet and much more ecologically sound. And there's, this woman won, I think, in
Such
Nobel
as
Prize.
where? Like where was
All
this?
kinds of places, even in places in Europe. Prior to the enclosure laws in the 1600s in the UK, most people there lived on subsistence farming off like hunting game. And then the government made it illegal and declared all
How do
game.
people who are randomly hunting game come up with ecological ways of being that solve climate change?
Well, you're making it sound like there's some big disconnect between those things.
Yes.
Hunting for subsistence food is an ecological way of being. That doesn't involve going to a supermarket and buying like a bunch of canned food from a food system that produces
Fair enough.
massive amounts of climate change.
What's the status of the elk?
I mean,
Can you take it and go for the movement speed?
status quo is always an option.
Okay. Tannic evidence. Tannic talks about sort of the war for talent and speaks of sort of brain drain that occurs. How does the F result in brain drain when it's established as a national standard for education?
Well, so the rhetoric that you're using, and I think you'd agree, the plan isn't going to do anything for competitiveness for years, because a lot of the people that you're affecting are like in middle school. So in the short term, what's that going to require? More H-1B visas in order to ensure
Wait,
that...
why does the plan require that?
Well, the rhetoric of the plan requires
The
it.
rhetoric of the plan?
Yeah, rhetoric's important. I already got an MA.
All right. So from the 1NC and cross-X, what are the parts of the app that the negative is disagreeing with? Yeah?
Discourse is the frame and
Okay, when you say the discourse of justification, what does that mean?
the justification for using competitiveness as a reason why we should pass the plan as a reason why the US is.
Okay, yeah, so the negative is saying the idea is that we ought to be competitive, hegemonic, concerned about these issues of globalization, tend to be very problematic, and instead we ought to reframe our calculus. How is the negative saying we should reframe our calculus? Yeah, we should look at everything as a global set of goods. There were a few different impacts that Sean read, but none of them were in the tags of the cards. Although Sean is very clear and easy to hear and flow, did anyone catch what are the reasons that this global neoliberal war is problematic? Yeah?
There's increased structural violence, military industrial complex, climate change, food crisis, and a lot of other stuff.
Yeah, so there was some impact arguments about climate change, there were some impact arguments about food crises, the war on the global south, and taking other forms of violence. It's important, and one thing I wanted to comment that I thought was great about the 1NC is that you can hear all of these things, so that when he references them later and pulls out all of this explanation in the 2NC, it's not going to sound brand new, but rather you're going to say, oh yeah, I remember that. Especially in these debates that are highly about historical examples and understanding theoretical reasons, being able to clearly articulate and understand everything that came out of the 1NC is quite important, and it also comes out a lot in cross-X. So like, Sean always had examples of something when she was like, you're a hippie, you're making things up. It's like, no, actually, here's some lawsuits, here's Europe in the pre-1600s. I have no idea what any of this stuff is, but it sounded really compelling when Sean was talking about it. Do you have?
Yeah, one of the things that I want to amplify about what Brian is saying is a rule that I would use for yourself is the longer the card you're reading, the more that you need to have variation in tone. So the longer the card, the less monotone you can be. You have to keep a judge engaged, and you have to make it clear. Anybody remember the portion in the alternative card where Sean tried to use variation in tone to set up his answer to a permutation? Or really just to draw like a high contrast between the half and the neg? Anybody hear that? No? Human capital, remember the part where he talked about frameworks of human capital versus social ecology? I did. I was listening, I was paying attention, so you gotta listen to the evidence too. Reward the person who is reading evidence in a way that you can understand and listen to, right? By listening to the internals of that evidence. There's a reason that there's variation in tone. It's not just because he's slow.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, Shri is probably going to be able to talk about those intricacies because they were clear in the cards and you could hear them. So it will help the debate flesh out forever.
Notice Shri also used the process strategy of building in a premise or a claim that must be responded to, rather than simply asking for open-ended explanation. Okay? Particularly in asking questions about the alternative. Thank goodness, he didn't just say, "What is the alternative?" really aggressively like 5 times. Okay? Which is the typical process strategy for this situation. I've seen it many times. Too many times. Okay? Instead, he's asking about the commons. He's asking about how people will make decisions about or in the commons. Right? His follow-up questions try and use some of those claims to say, like, how are we going to make decisions about which set of technologies to deploy in the commons, right? We're no longer using kind of a set of consumer preferences that are aggregated in terms of price. We've got to have a different decision-making mechanism. Who's going to control those decision-making mechanisms? Okay? Sean says a bunch about Elinor Ostrom and the studies for the commons. This is, in fact, Nobel Prize-winning work. We'll see how much further either side develops some of that material, because there are definitely components that you could know about that stuff that would be very relevant to explaining either half answers or negative alternative solvency. Okay? It's a good example, too, where both sides actually know some stuff about this alternative because they have thought about it. Okay? It's clear that not just Sean has read some stuff about the commons, right? Shri knows some things, too, that he's building into his questions and thinking about in terms of his early strategy.
One other question I wanted to ask people: what strategy is being set up in the 1NC process that is likely to come up in the 2AC and later on? What set of arguments are going to come from these process questions? Or was Shri just like, I don't know what to do, so I'll just ask some random questions and I have no game plan? Yeah?
I know all solvency.
Yeah, it's likely that this debate is going to have a very big push on whether or not the alternative solves. It was about 2.5 minutes of process. How are we going to change these things? How do people make decisions? You know, are we going to get to deploy new renewable energies? How are we going to get those? How are we going to get carbon out of the atmosphere? So it's clear that Shri is setting up a set of alternative fails, no alternative. The affirmative is a necessary step arguments into his speech already.
Another thing about that, or a connected issue, both sides are setting up. I think both sides are having to respond to the fact that one of the things that's true about the 1NC link evidence that's somewhat in tension with the way that the debate proceeded in the 1AC and the 1NC is the set of policies that the 1NC evidence outlines that are typically connected to the concept of competitiveness. What does the 1NC evidence have to say about the way in which the narrative or the discourse of competitiveness has typically produced in terms of policy options in education? Anybody listening closely enough to follow that one? Oh man, I gotta listen to some of the cards. What are you gonna do? Yes, student Brian Harmon. What were some of those policies that were mentioned in those 1NC cards?
Private schools, charter schools, getting rid of national mandates.
Okay, so is that, like, where does that stand in relationship to the affirmatives plan? This is not a difficult question.
Is the affirmative pro charter schools, or is the affirmative against charter schools? Is the affirmative for having national standards about education, or against having standards for national education?
What great! It's like to have some part of their strategy that uses or responds to this tension, right? And you felt that in the process. Like, the negative has some arguments to set up, like, yes, these two things are in tension. When we talk about competitiveness, we usually don't end up thinking about this in terms of a right to equal education, right? And the affirmative is going to use some of the arguments about the way in which it's like, well, we're using the right to equal education to produce something that looks like competitiveness for the national economy. So both sides are going to have a way of reconciling those differences in the evidence. And I suspect that they will. It'll probably revolve around a lot of how the alternative is explained as well as the answers to the alternative. Okay? So I want people to be paying attention to that and thinking about that a fair amount in terms of the spin, as we shall say, that comes later in the debate. I think that's what I got. Okay. Okay. So, how many pieces of paper do you have out right now? Yeah, I think 3 is minimum, 4 is advisable. How many arguments were you putting on each side of the page? 3 to 4.
The arguments sure you're about to make in 8 minutes answering this position. Take a guess. Give me more than 5? Is it going to be more than 10? Like, it's going to be a lot.
It's going to be a large number. Okay, so you need several pieces of paper.
Really good? Everybody got enough pieces of paper? Okay. All right, is everybody good? I assume that's a yes. Okay.
Your ballot should evaluate competing institutional arrangements without prioritizing competing narratives, lacking the blueprint kills office to say or not around politically conventionally evident. You must be effective considers alternative social arrangements, alternative physical understanding with no acknowledgement that depends on construction progressive frameworks which would replace all with the right questions of alternatives. And what is bad about the cannot be debated? Does liberalism provide the best framework? What should be the people's rights? And no prior questions. Front loading epistemology makes problem-driven approaches impossible owing to the nature of the philosophical currents that prioritizing epistemology and special power theoretical kind is not wholly dependent philosophical commitments. One need not be sympathetic to our institutes and recognize that before certain problems provide a best account prioritization of epistemological based theory-driven rather than problem-driven approach, where there are general explanations of questions that cannot be prejudged before conducting the inquiry. This substantive pursuit of generality over empirical validity and floating picks are a voter for fairness in education moods. The one is to force us to debate ourselves avoids clash of atomic mechanisms in favor of semantic advantage reading. The competitiveness case stands a pick as an impact and solves the offense. And now case outweighs the case. There's an independent great power war from educational competitiveness, lack of US-led innovation, language skills, reason loss and influence, the cuts of counterbalancing the sabotages, solutions to existential threats like WMD proliferation warming and retreat from US-led orders, not multipolarity, but apolarity, which accelerates crisis as Haas and Duncan. US-led liberalism is on the brink. Alt hatred of freedom, accelerating transition, War 16. Rest of the borders comes from simplism, global regime, just after World War II, global divided into US-led group that embrace democracy, free trade, Soviet and Chinese-led group, favored isolations, the liberal bloc succeeded that trend, halted and appears to be moving in the other direction. US-led project produces war with the US-led orders collapsing the SES and Senator Roxanne, spirals into broader conflict in the Russian invasion of the Baltic, which are part of NATO to trigger major conflicts with Leland, Rose, will continue to splash multiplying extinction outweighs quality of life, Patterson, 3 death. This was subject to independent calculations about a worse life change that interface with the process of maintaining existence of objective evil. It is ultimate value for the subject of source law possibility. Now, competitive theory isn't propaganda. 3 warrants 1 knowledge economy, increased globalization, automation demands K-12 students learn the requisite language, cross-cultural critical thinking skills to forge international connections with the market that's done. This doesn't create a binary between immaterial IT and material blue-collar work. Our internal link was never tech leadership, but about subject standards across the board, even heavy industry sectors like agriculture and water, and one is in life require smart students with the grasp of humanities and vocational expertise to innovate too. Realism countries are driven by self-interest to seek relative improvements and capability. Just because they just stop running the race of neoliberal hedge doesn't mean the race doesn't exist. That's all striving for competitiveness is inevitable. All can overcome the status quo. Vinesky, Moscow, 15. The national policymakers pay attention to competitors breaking international economic organization. Competitiveness is a prerequisite for stability. Global economic companies and general population pay attention to interaction, comparison, competitiveness, and even if our epistemology suspect is useful, global institutions act as if competitiveness is true by assessing economic governance and relative productivity based on general equilibrium model that's Martin and Kabani all can't tell Cameron Palin. 4. Even if the years are wrong, the issue is whether source can or believe it is sufficient people to prepare to invest time and money. If enough people exist, any myth becomes reality. If enough policymakers believe 80% of this voluntary trade flows is incumbent, they prepare their state. Now, social citizenship tradition solved. John concedes that the plain's right to education in the 14th Amendment ruling is distinct from the status quo deregulation because it creates a precedent for positive rights and forces government to set a social safety net to minimize the worst existing neoliberalism. Zero solvency debate means that the plan spills over to basic supports like healthcare, food security, quality of life, and even the commons, which destabilize structural violence, weakening the spark evidence. 6. Positive economic rights recognize education fundamental the equal protection clause. How is education distribution and interest of the shelter the duty to education and beyond economic constitutional citizenship guarantee extends beyond education, beyond the medical safety like equal citizenship extends to systems of support like providing foundation for participation such as health insurance, child care, transportation subsidies, income tax credit, anti-discrimination laws, decent livelihood for all, duties, call legislators to combine purpose with a good faith. And neolib bad is the worst meme that's epistemologically bankrupt because it replaces empirics and specificity for totalizing abstraction. Barnett, 10, and neolib the preference by expression abstraction associated failure with theories, particular speech formation. This makes it impossible against a generalized plans of referring empirical evidence politically context neolib pay. No attention to the degree to which labor markets is built in against fully flexible labor markets and supports of the investment, particular locations, and effective people, legislative responses reduced to understanding how logic is known and advanced is enacted. And now neoliberalism is good and sustainable. They all accelerates inequality, ensures right-wing takeover. 17 people blame the neoliberal ideology for woes on the right, protections, xenophobic ideas to replace free market libertarians. People having become too quick to throw scientific technocracy in the dustbin of history, despite the great recession. Developed countries have not seen the economic collapse, wages are increasing, and bottom income distribution, home prices, stock markets recovered. There are still economic problems, but it's clear that economies based on neoliberalism have not suffered systemic collapse. The Great Depression, profit countries, fascism, militarism, and firm to the plan, then embrace the commons of educational practice. Neoliberalism solves warming in the short term. Alternative can't solve. Tipping point fast enough to avoid extinction. Parenting manual 15. Let's be clear with short verses. Long term, I don't think the left has the capacity to choice for the economy to avoid in time to avoid capitalism has a record of achieving around reform. We have to mitigate GMGs immediately to buy our time to adapt changing class relations. Does not mean changing tech environments in America, making progress in class, but not fossil fuels decarbonization. Does not fall from socialist experiments. Capital society can do things capital doesn't like. It needs regulation and being innovative. We need to force capitalism to build new energy. Competitiveness drives cooperation and equity. West of the quality of the nation education system. Determinative growth of its economy to the extent America's education systems stagnates as other countries advance its economy. Global influence will suffer. Competitiveness can be useful to foster urgency, recognition of achievement gap, and broaden support for controversial reforms. Education competition fosters investigation factors that lead to higher and more equitable performance. Now, permutation do both establishing equal rights in education while embracing the commons as an educational practice shields the link that Sean says the process of the 14th Amendment will be able to establish the common standard for advocacy since the war on talent is exacerbated by abandoning, quote, commitments to comprehensive schooling that threatens educational justice and equality. It says that it promotes, for example, privatized schooling. The plan avoids those things. It also avoids brain drain by raising the achievement of students at home instead of importing high school workers. There's nothing about the plan that requires anybody. So the plan's challenge to privatized school choice is the direction we all guilty of 14 public education stakeholders need to reach a better government and neoliberal ideas are connected to choice in schools with the halls and forget the notion that every child is guaranteed civil rights, education, free public under constitutional control of the democratic ideals are stubborn, and now elites will crush the ultimate Scott. 6. The way to break free of capitalists to turn prevalent representation on its head. No hint about practical reform attempts to break free, running to stubborn realities, integrated social relations. The turn also opens the door to disconcerting idealism that revolves nothing but theoretical ideas and conditional alter voter fairness scheme strategy by shifting between movements instead of commons avoiding clash about method, and the all fractious coalitions will strengthen right-wing populism. Bold Farm 17. Neolib frustrates coalitions against threats of meaningless elites speak destructive of words without recognizing distinction. You cannot tell the difference between the left and the right. One difference among progressives are exaggerated when you use neolib as a source of every problem. You create a chasm between yourself and other Americans that survive the Democratic task. Neolib identifies both Clinton and Trump. This identification covers a political conflict as it divides the left so it can be conquered. And economic realities exceed discourse. Scott says they one-sidedly argue the discourse gets real. The economy becomes methodological performance. Tech accumulation, profit circulation of capital becomes inherent as cultural shifts occur deeply rooted economic logic, require investigation on their own terms beyond the causal powers of discourse. And methodological nationalism is never boiled down to methodological nationalism. Constituted the starters predicted states to continue to think with borders how they change. Escapes difficult to social science remains symbiotic with the United States. And the starting point of the commons requires to quote a refusal of work in this later evidence. Transition to a post-work society reinforces inequality, fashion, console, 15 idea the post-work economy will evolve. Choosing between utopias to strongly naive, the result will be catastrophe. It seems unlikely the political economy will become conducive to redistribution because the value of capital assets will skyrocket with ownership concentrated. It would lead to fascism. It remains an ideological force of lived experience, and work is inevitable, and the commons trades adopted labor organization, which turns their impact console, 15 stories about work ending, disrupting the problems of the workforce while ignoring transitional matters, globalization, technology, the street is the same, when they are not dreams about they dream about a world where problems of labor doesn't exist because they've been magically solved. This is a problem because compensation is some of the biggest challenges. There's no need to organize, seek full employment. The more this comforting fiction takes, the easier it is to become resigned to low wages.
Okay, so the first thing I want to ask you about is this contention that critique of neoliberalism leads to right-wing takeover.
Yep.
Isn't the discourse used by people, including Trump, who voted for Trump, that America needs to come first and that the U.S. workers have not been able to compete globally?
There's clearly a distinction between when
Oh,
Clinton
it's
and
not clear
Obama
to me at
says
all,
things
that's what I'm
like,
asking.
well, it is clear, right? When Clinton and Obama says America first and puts in
They don't
policies
say
that are
that.
more liberalizing.
They
Yes, they do. Duncan is part of the DOE during Obama. He says that America should come first, right? But at the same time, right, the policies that are passed will move that discourse is still not the conservative sort of like, economic isolationism that Trump describes, which sort of proves that you need a delineation between the right and the left, not some random backwards phrase like neoliberalism.
That was a nice bit of sleight of hand, but as we talked about earlier, while Obama was like, we need to reduce tariffs, we need to have global engagement, Trump is obviously advocating the exact opposite of that. I'm not conflating the two, I'm saying Trump's America first and Obama's not, and then you said they're saying the same thing. I'm confused.
No. Even if the rhetoric is that of American primacy, right, that does not change the fact that
The rhetoric's not about American privacy, the rhetoric's about
I
trade
guess
tariffs
we'll
and
agree to
America
disagree.
coming first in economics. Okay. Well, so you say that elites are going to crush the alternative.
Yes.
Who are these elites?
Trump, for example, or people
Okay,
who
so
don't like the hunting
why isn't that-
societies or the one and
Why isn't the claim that elites will crush the affirmative of the alternative equally true of the app, which runs contrary
We get
to everything?
A, durable fiat, B, you don't have an answer that solves
Your
the
plan
advantages
doesn't
of
do
the app.
anything. Whoa. Yeah, well, I read answers on the K, but
Yeah, you read advantages.
Hold on.
so
Okay,
the
let me ask you, I'm
advantages
asking you a
solve
question. So you say you get durable fiat. Does any part of the plan increase funding?
It mandates funding.
No, it doesn't. Where in the plan?
What
part of the
14th
plan?
Amendment, wait, the 14th Amendment right to education would require
Which part do
national
you
standards,
think-
would require funding.
No, which part do you think says that's not what the case that you're referencing, that your evidence is talking about Rodriguez is about?
That's-
Do you have any evidence?
that's
Which
what
piece
we're
of
talking
okay,
about.
okay, which piece of what which piece of 1AC evidence do you think says the plan needs to fund? Just tell me what part it says. Which one?
The Liu evidence.
The Liu evidence. Read a
Yeah.
line for me from that piece of evidence that you think says the plan needs to fund.
I'm gonna pull up the 1AC. Okay. Standards-based
Which
reform
Luke are you reading from?
to funding. States can't support independently. Federal intervention is key to equal distribution.
Yeah, well, the distribution being equal isn't the same thing as funding increasing.
What?
The distribution of funding could
The
decrease.
Liu
but
evidence
funding
says
could
you
still be
should
equal.
increase funding to equalize distribution.
Yeah, but your plan doesn't mandate that.
What are you talking about?
Your plan doesn't mandate an increase in funding. The Liu evidence just says it'd be equal. You can equalize funding in two
There's
ways.
evidence
by
that says
increasing
that's
or by
the effects
decreasing.
of the plan. You haven't
Okay, yeah, that's what I'm
tested
asking you.
that.
Which evidence says it's an effect of the plan? Your
Your
evidence
evidence
says you
is right.
should do that. It's aspirational, not descriptive.
Right. What? That doesn't make any sense.
All right. Starting out with the 2AC. About how many arguments do we have in this 2AC? 20? Yeah, some number in the 20s. One thing that might help in the 2AC is having a little bit of numbers on them. But I think I have 22. Someone else said 24. Yeah, there's a lot of diverse options for what the 2AC has put out. So the 1AR could go for a set of alt, fails, and link turn arguments. They could go for some impact turn arguments. They can go for the case is good. They can just go for the alt doesn't do anything and the app is more pragmatic. They have some permutations. Why is it useful for the 2AC to have all of these different types of arguments? Yeah.
Block, all time, whatever.
Yeah, the block is going to be 13 minutes, and Shri is going to be able to then choose one or two of the insulated strategies that can be set up to be able to extend in the 1AR, so the 2AC gave us a diversity of strategies. Another thing that I think was quite important, when Shri is reading all of his alternative offensive arguments, are they all just tagged as like, Ks don't do anything, Ks are stupid? Miles is saying no. What
how is he tagging them that's making these arguments so effective? Yeah?
He uses like the language of salient and tags them specifically about.
Yeah, Sri is constantly pulling out language of the alternative that is read by Sean and the questions he asked in cross-ex to link his arguments to the critique. So he's not just saying generically like, no one cares about discourse, or things don't matter, or the only thing that matters is pragmatism. No, he's going specifically in to the 1NC evidence and saying, here are the issues with the way you framed the comments that continually come up. The same thing is true with the link terms that he's making. He's using the evidence of cross-ex about the 14th Amendment, about equal protection that Sean said was important, and pulling out that that is exactly what the plan does. I wanted to also talk a little bit about this cross-examination that happened, about whether or not the plan solves, what the plan goes to, etc. One thing you'll notice is that Sri is heavily relying on the fact and using the fact that the 1NC does not include answers to the solvency mechanism of the affirmative. He's pointing out it's like we've read a bunch of evidence that says this is what the plan does, you have to read evidence the other way. On the contrary, Sean is trying to dig through and say, this is what the 1NC evidence actually says and why it's not sufficient. This maybe reflects that if we had a little bit of these solvency arguments in the 1NC and earlier, maybe it would flesh out in a way that's better for one of them or the other. So I assume that that debate is likely to start to develop.
Just a side note, I would be taking notes on Brian's commentary. I feel like he's saying some pretty smart stuff. And so it's like having a separate page where you can track some of that, and many of you are, which is good. That's some of you are not, just not. Would be smart. One of the things that I would say about, or I want to ask okay. First, make the point about the positive rights argument. Okay. This is a category of argument that we don't see a lot in, I think, or developed that thoroughly in a lot of critique debates. This is really, the analogy to the other debates that you're having is that this is an internal link argument, right? The question is, does the advocacy of the 1AC, so something that says we should do a national right to education in order to have a competitive national economy, will that produce an economy that is structurally violent, that is highly unequal, that is interested in a war for talent internationally, right? Or will it produce the social citizenship tradition in which national economies are competing, but a welfare state helps support those national economies, right? What, for just so many bonus points, okay? I want you to think back to Sean's topic lecture. Conjure up in your minds Sean's topic lecture. What transition, historical transition that Sean pointed out, are these two having an argument about?
Shift, I think it was in the 80s and the 90s towards a more globalized world where we changed our definition of competition. Whereas prior it was about fighting terrorists and making sure that other countries can compete, but now it's about getting rid of those terrorists and ensuring that that other companies come to our country and give us jobs, et cetera, not being terrorists and letting them against other countries.
Yeah?
Also, the beginning of the shift to knowledge economy.
Yes. Yes, excellent point by your camp friends. Okay, you've got in many ways they're having a debate over the meaning of competition that mirrors some of what this is what we talk about when we talk about a discourse. Okay, that is a larger set of institutionalized practices and languages that are used to describe and evaluate the world over time. And in some ways, they're having a debate about whether or not competitiveness as a discourse or as a concept is consistent with a social citizenship tradition. That is a debate about sort of, is this an economy that's going to produce something that's more like the 60s and the 70s, where you have national industrial and educational policies that are part of the welfare state that kind of supports the idea that, while we are competing about our comparative advantages as national economies, we're committed to the idea that global growth is also possible, right? Or